It happened again today. The Nazis weren't socialists. Screams the offended socialist. It's in the name, I rightly point out. So, democratic is in North Korea's name, screams the offended socialist. Hey. Hitler told everyone they were socialist, and then enacted laws making them socialist. Let's give these morons a history lesson, in Doomkopf's own words. We shall banish want. We shall banish fear. The essence of socialism is human welfare. Rooted in life for every American from childhood to old age. Wow, sound familiar? Guess who said it? AOC? Bernie Sanders? Nope. Adolf Hitler. I just replaced the word German with American. Because it seems inseparable German with American. Because it seems inseparable from the social idea, and we do not believe that there could ever exist a state with lasting inner health if it is not built on internal social justice, and so we have joined forces with this knowledge.
Adolf Hitler, Why We Are Anti-Semites, August 2015, 1920 Speech in Mittel from Vierteljahrshefte für Zeitgeschichte, 16. Jahr, 4. H, Oktet, 1968, pp 390 bis 420.
There is a difference between the theoretical knowledge of socialism and the practical life of socialism. People are not born socialists, but must first be taught how to become them. German Volksgenossen. Hitler's opening speech at the new Winterhilfswerk.
Deutschlandhalle, Berlin, Oktober 5, 1937. Also quoted in The Third Reich, A New History by Michael Burley.
Our fight is with money. Work alone will help us, not money. We must smash interest slavery. Our fight is with the races that represent money. Speech at the Hall of Zunduchenreich, December 18, 1919, quoted in Thomas Weber, Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi, Basic Books, 2017, page 138. Police report of DAP meeting, SAM, DPM/6697. Socialism as the final concept of duty, the ethical duty of work, not just for oneself but also for one's fellow man's sake, and above all the principle, common good before own good, a struggle against all parasitism and especially against easy and unearned income. And we were aware that in this fight we can rely on no one but our own people. We are convinced that socialism in the right sense will only be possible in nations and races that are Aryan, and there in the first place we hope for our own people and are convinced that socialism is inseparable from nationalism. 1920 speech in Munich at the Hofbrauhaus. Speech also known as Why Are We Anti-Semites? Translated from Viertelgeschichte für Zeitgeschichte, 16. Jarg, 4. H. October, 1968, pages 390 to 420. Edited by Carolyn Yeager. Since we are socialists, we must necessarily also be anti-Semites because we want to fight against the very opposite, materialism and mammonism. How can you not be an anti-Semite, being a socialist? Why We Are Anti-Semites, August 15, 1920 speech in Munich at the Hofbrauhaus. Translated from Viertelgeschichte für Zeitgeschichte, 16. Jarg, 4. H. October, 1968. Pages 390 to 420. Edited by Carolyn Yeager. The Jews have shown real genius in profiting by politics. This capitalistic people, which was brought into existence by the unscrupulous exploitation of men, has understood how to get the leadership of the Fourth Estate into its own hands, and by acting both on the right and on the left it has its apostles in both camps. On the right the Jew does his best to encourage all the evils there are to such an extent that the man of the people, poor devil, will be exasperated as much as possible, greed of money, unscrupulousness, hard-heartedness, abominable snobbishness. More and more Jews have wormed their way into our upper-class families, and the consequence has been that the ruling class has been alienated from its own people. As quoted in A History of National Socialism, Conrad Hayden, Methuen and Company, Ltd., London, UK, 1934, page 58. Speech in April, 1922. At the founding of this movement, we formed the decision that we would give expression to this idea of ours of the identity of the two conceptions, despite all warning. On the basis of the sincerity of our will, we christened it National Socialist. We said to ourselves that to be national means above everything to act with a boundless and all-embracing love for the people and, if necessary, even to die for it. And similarly, to be social means so to build up the state and the community of the people that every individual acts in the interest of the community of the people that every individual acts in the interest of the community of the people and must be to such an extent convinced of the goodness, of the honorable straightforwardness of this community of the people as to be ready to die for it. Munich, speech of April 12, 1922. There are no such things as classes, that means race. Munich, speech of April 12, 1922. Socialism is the science of dealing with the commonweal. Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. The Marxians have stolen the term and confused its meaning. Socialism away from the socialists. Socialism is an ancient Aryan, Germanic institution. Our German ancestors held certain lands in common. They cultivated the idea of the commonweal. Marxism has no right to disguise itself as socialism. Socialism, unlike Marxism, does not repudiate private property. Unlike Marxism, it involves no negation of personality, and unlike Marxism, it is patriotic. We might have called ourselves the Liberal Party. We chose to call ourselves the National Socialists. Socialism is national. We demand the fulfillment of the just claims of the productive classes by the state on the basis of race solidarity. To us, state and race are one. Interview with George Sylvester Viereck, 1923. To put it quite clearly, we have an economic program. Point number 13 in that program demands the nationalization of all public companies, in other words socialization, or what is known here as socialism. The basic principle of my party's economic program should be made perfectly clear, and that is the principle of authority. The good of the community takes priority over the retain control. Every owner should feel himself to be an agent of the state. It is his duty not to misuse his possessions to the detriment of the state or the interests of his fellow countrymen. That is the overriding point. The Third Reich will always retain the right to control property owners. If you say that the bourgeoisie is tearing its hair over the question of private property, that does not affect me in the least. Does the bourgeoisie expect some consideration from me? Today's bourgeoisie is rotten to the core. It has no ideals anymore. All it wants to do is earn money, and so it does me what damage it can. The bourgeois press does me damage, consign me and my movement to the devil. Hitler's interview with Richard Brighting, 1931, published in Eduard Kalik edition. First interview with Hitler, May 4, 1931, Secret Conversations with Hitler. The two newly discovered 1931 interviews, New York, John Day Company, 9-33. Also published under the title Unmasked, two confidential interviews with Hitler in 1931, published by Chatto and Wingdus in 1971. What matters is to emphasize the fundamental idea in my party's economic program clearly, the idea of authority. I want the authority. I want everyone to keep the property he has acquired for himself according to the principle, benefit to the community precedes benefit to the individual. But the state should retain supervision and each property owner should consider himself appointed by the state. It is his duty not to use his property against the interests of others among his own people. This is the crucial matter. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property. In 1931, as quoted in Nazi Economics, Ideology, Theory, and Policy, 1990, by Avram Barkai, pages 26-27. Lift up your hearts and draw new faith from the resurrection of our people. Ultimately we shall live to see the kingdom of freedom, honor, and social justice. Long live Germany! Speech at the Lustgarten in Berlin, April 4, 1932. As quoted in Hitler's Berlin, Abused City. Thomas Friedrich, Yale University Press, 2012, page 272. The struggle between the people and the hatred amongst them is being nurtured by very specific interested parties. It is a small, rootless, international clique that is turning the people against each other, that does not want them to have peace. It is the people who are at home both nowhere and everywhere, who do not have anywhere a soil on which they have grown up, but who live in Berlin today, in Brussels tomorrow, Paris the day after that, and then again in Prague or Vienna or London, and who feel at home everywhere. Man in audience shouts Jews. They are dressed as international elements, because they conduct their business everywhere, but the people cannot follow them. The people are bounded to their soil, bounded to its fatherland, bounded to the possibilities of life that the state, the nation, offers. A speech at the Siemens Dynamo Works in Berlin, November 10, 1933. 3. National Socialism derives from each of the two camps the pure idea that characterizes it, national resolution from bourgeois tradition, vital, creative socialism from the teaching of Marxism. Interview by Hans Jost in Frankfurter Volksblatt, January 27, 1934, David Schoenbaum, Hitler's status in Nazi Germany, 1933–1939, New York, W. W. Norton and Company, 1997, page 57. The main plank in the National Socialist program is to abolish the liberalistic concept of the individual and the Marxist concept of humanity and to substitute therefore the folk community, rooted in the soil and bound together by the bond of its common blood. On National Socialism and World Relations, speech delivered by Hitler in the German Reichstag, January 30, 1937. German translation published by H. Müller and Sohn in Berlin. Or more excellent kind of socialism, and is there a truer form of democracy than this National Socialism which is so organized that through it each one among the millions of German boys is given the possibility of finding his way to the highest office in the nation, should it please Providence to come to his aid? Speech by Adolf Hitler on National Socialism and World Relations. Adolf Hitler on National Socialism and World Relations, delivered in the German Reichstag, January 30, 1937. German translation published by H. Müller and Sohn in Berlin. And numerous people whose families belong to the peasantry and working classes are now filling prominent positions in this Some of them actually hold the highest offices in the leadership of the nation, as cabinet ministers, Reichsstatthalter, and Gauleiter. But National Socialism always bears in mind the interests of the people as a whole and not the interests of one class or another. The National Socialist Revolution has not aimed at turning a privileged class into a class of rights in the future. Its aim has been to grant equal rights to those social strata that hitherto were denied such rights. Speech by Adolf Hitler on National Socialism and World Relations, delivered in the German Reichstag, January 30, 1937. German translation published by H. Müller and Sohn in Berlin. Socialist I define from the word social, meaning in the main social equity. A socialist is one who serves the common good without giving up his individuality or personality or the product of his personal efficiency. Our adopted term socialist has nothing to do with Marxism is anti-property, true socialism is not. Marxism places no value on the individual or individual effort of efficiency. True socialism values the individual and encourages him in individual efficiency, at the same time holding that his interests as an individual must be in consonance with those of the community. All great inventions, discoveries, achievements were first the product of an individual brain. It is charged against me that I am against property, that I am an atheist. Both charges are false. Speech given on December 28, 1938, quoted in the speeches of April 1922, August 1939, page 93. We want a society with neither castes nor ranks, and you must not allow these ideas to grow within you. In those countries, it is actually capital that rules, that is, nothing more than a clique of a few hundred men who possess untold wealth and, as a consequence of the peculiar structure of their national life, are more or less independent and free. They say, here we have liberty. By this they mean, above all, an uncontrolled economy, and by an uncontrolled economy, the freedom not only to acquire capital but to make absolutely free use of it. That means freedom from national control or control capital and in its employment. This is really what they mean when they speak of liberty. These capitalists create their own press and then speak of the freedom of the press. In reality, every one of the newspapers has a master, and in every case this master is the capitalist, the owner. This master, not the editor, is the one who directs the policy of the paper. If the editor tries to write other than what suits the master, he is ousted the next day. This press, which is the absolutely submissive and characterless slave of the owners, molds public opinion. Speech to the Workers of Berlin, December 10. The creation of a socially just state, a model society that would continue to eradicate all social barriers. Speech to workers at Berlin's Rheinmetall Borsig factory, October 10, 1940. As quoted in Hitler's Beneficiaries, Plunder, Racial War, and the Nazi Welfare State, Gotts Alley, New York, Metropolitan Books, 2007, page 13. I, on the other hand, have tried for 2 decades to build a new socialist order in Germany, with a minimum of interference and without harming our productive capacity. Hitler's Barbarossa Proclamation, June 22, 1941. National Socialism came to power in Germany in the same year as Roosevelt was elected president. Roosevelt comes from a rich family and belongs to the class whose path is smoothed in the democracies. I am only the child of a small, poor family and had to fight my way by work and industry. He got to know only its pleasant consequences, enjoyed by those who do business while others bleed. I shared the fate of millions, and Franklin Roosevelt only the fate of the so-called upper 10,000. He made profits out of the inflation, out of the misery of others, while I, together with many hundreds of thousands more, lay in hospital. Speech declaring war, lay in hospital. Speech declaring war against the United States, December 11, 1941. Defining what socialism really is. Socialism is a loaded term that people like to throw around. Unfortunately, there are almost as many definitions of socialism as there are people throwing the term around. Some clarity is in order. The classic definition of socialism is an economic system in which the government owns the bulk of land, natural resources and capital, factories, equipment, etc. Government officials decide what is produced and how it's produced, and government officials determine the distribution of income. Today, many people who identify as socialist or otherwise routinely shove the classic definition aside. But it's the only definition that makes sense. Here's why. The term socialism came into widespread use in the 1830s. The word was deliberately chosen to express opposition to individualism, as in economic individualism, as in private property, private enterprise and voluntary exchange, or, in a word that came into being some 50 years later, capitalism. Economic individualism, or capitalism, is an economic system in which the bulk of land, natural resources and capital are privately owned. Consequently, decisions about what is produced, how it's produced, and who gets what's produced are predominantly made by private individuals through markets. Socialism, in opposition to economic individualism, means the bulk of land, natural resources and capital are owned and managed collectively by society. But as a practical matter, collective ownership means government ownership, and collective management of resources means decisions about what is produced, how it's produced, and who gets what's produced are made by government officials, not private individuals. Hence the classic definition of socialism. Today, many socialists consider socialism to be a set of values rather than an economic system. For instance, many socialists today define socialism as a commitment to creating a more egalitarian society, a commitment to promoting the values of community and cooperation over selfishness and competition, and a particular concern for the poor. Viewing socialism as a set of values, they reject the classic definition of socialism. The problem with a values definition of socialism, though, is it provides little if any clue about what socialism, as an economic system, would be. It quite possibly could be capitalism. Economic individualists from Adam Smith and David Hume to F.A. Hayek and Deirdre McCloskey have argued that capitalist societies are more egalitarian than most societies in history, including authoritarian socialist societies. They have always regarded selfishness as a vice, have repeatedly argued that protecting individual liberty strengthens rather than diminishes community, and have always had a keen eye for how different economic systems affect the living standards of the poor. A socialist, according to the values definition, who is persuaded by such arguments, is thus a socialist in favor of capitalism. A definition that logically leads to the conclusion that socialism can be capitalism is a mess. Other people think that welfare programs make an economy socialist. They don't. Programs that redistribute income leave the bulk of land, natural resources and capital in private hands, which leaves the bulk of production decisions in private hands, which leaves a capitalist economy a capitalist economy. Yes, redistributing income can affect what is produced and who gets it, but the effect is small and utterly minuscule compared to a system in which the state owns and directs the means of production. To claim that an economy with welfare programs is socialist is to claim that capitalism can be socialism. That's another mess.
Why Nazism was socialism, and why socialism is totalitarian. My purpose today is to make just two main points. 1. To show why Nazi Germany was a socialist state, not a capitalist one. And 2. To show why socialism, understood as an economic system based on government ownership of the means of production, positively requires a totalitarian dictatorship. The identification of Nazi Germany as a socialist state was one of the many great contributions of Ludwig von Mises. When one remembers that the word Nazi was an abbreviation for Der Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterspartei, in English translation, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Mises's identification might not appear all that noteworthy. For what should one expect the economic system of a country ruled by a party with socialist in its name to be but socialism? Nevertheless, apart from Mises and his readers, practically no one thinks of Nazi Germany as a socialist state. It is far more common to believe that it represented a form of capitalism, which is what the communists and all other Marxists have claimed. The basis of the claim that Nazi Germany was capitalist was the fact that most industries in Nazi Germany appeared to be left in private hands. What Mises identified was that private ownership of the means of production existed in name only under the Nazis, and that the actual substance of ownership of the means of production resided in the German government. For it was the German government, and not the nominal private owners, that exercised all of the substantive powers of ownership. It, not the nominal private owners, decided what was to be produced, in what quantity, by what methods, and to whom it was to be distributed, as well as what prices would be charged and what wages would be paid, and what dividends or other income the nominal private owners would be permitted to receive. The position of the alleged private owners, Mises showed, was reduced essentially to that of government pensioners. De facto government ownership of the means of production, as Mises termed it, was logically implied by such fundamental collectivist principles embraced by the Nazis, as that the common good comes before the private good and the individual exists as a means to the ends of the state. If the individual is a means to the ends of the state, so too, of course, is his property. Just as he is owned by the state, his property is also owned by the state. But what specifically established de facto socialism in Nazi Germany was the introduction of price and wage controls in 1936. These were imposed in response to the inflation of the money supply carried out by the regime from the time of its coming to power in early 1933. The Nazi regime inflated the money supply as the means of financing the vast increase in government spending required by its programs of public works, subsidies, and rearmament. The price and wage controls were imposed in response to the rise in prices that began to result from the inflation. The effect of the combination of inflation and price and wage controls is shortages, that is, a situation in which the quantities of goods people attempt to buy exceed the quantities available for sale. Shortages, in turn, result in economic chaos. It's not only that consumers, who show up in stores early in the day, are in a position to buy up all the stocks of goods and leave customers, who arrive later, with nothing, a situation to which governments typically respond by imposing rationing. Shortages result in chaos throughout the economic system. They introduce randomness in the distribution of supplies between geographical areas, in the allocation of a factor of production among its different products, in the allocation of labor and capital among the different branches of the economic system. In the face of the combination of price controls and shortages, the effect of a decrease in the supply of an item is not, as it would be in a free market, to raise its price and increase its profitability, thereby operating to stop the decrease in supply, or reverse it if it has gone too far. Price control prohibits the rise in price, and thus the increase in profitability. At the same time, the shortages caused by price controls prevent increases in supply from reducing price and profitability. When there is a shortage, the effect of an increase in supply is merely a reduction in the severity of the shortage. Only when the shortage is totally eliminated does an increase in supply necessitate a decrease in price and bring about a decrease in profitability. As a result, the combination of price controls and shortages makes possible random movements of supply without any effect on price and profitability. In this situation, the production of the most trivial and unimportant goods, even pet rocks, can be expanded at the expense of the production of the most urgently needed and important goods, such as life-saving medicines, with no effect on the price or profitability of either good. Price controls would prevent the production of the medicines from becoming more profitable as their supply decreased, while a shortage even of pet rocks prevented their production from becoming less profitable as their supply increased. As Mises showed, to cope with such unintended effects of its price controls, the government must either abolish the price controls or add further measures, namely, precisely the control over what is produced, in what quantity, by what methods, and to whom it is distributed, which I referred to earlier. The combination of price controls with this further set of controls constitutes the de facto socialization of the economic system. For it means that the government then exercises all of the substantive powers of ownership. This was the socialism instituted by the Nazis. And Mises calls it socialism on the German or Nazi pattern, in contrast to the more obvious socialism of the Soviets, which he calls socialism on the Russian or Bolshevik pattern. Of course, socialism does not end the chaos caused by the destruction of the price system. It perpetuates it. And if it is introduced without the prior existence of price controls, its effect is to inaugurate that very chaos. This is because socialism is not actually a positive economic system. It is merely the negation of capitalism and its price system. As such, the essential nature of socialism is one and the same as the economic chaos resulting from the destruction of the price system by price and wage controls. I want to point out that Bolshevik-style socialism's imposition of a system of production quotas, with incentives everywhere to exceed the quotas, is a sure formula for universal shortages, just as exist under all-around price and wage controls. At most, socialism merely changes the direction of the chaos. The government's control over production may make possible a greater production of some goods of special importance to itself, but it does so only at the expense of wreaking havoc throughout the rest of the economic system. This is because the government has no way of knowing the effects on the rest of the economic system of its securing the production of the goods to which it attaches special importance. The requirements of enforcing a system of price and wage controls shed major light on the totalitarian nature of socialism, most obviously, of course, on that of the German or Nazi variant of socialism, but also on that of Soviet-style socialism as well. We can start with the fact that the financial self-interest of sellers operating under price controls is to evade the price controls and raise their prices. Buyers otherwise unable to obtain goods are willing, indeed, eager to pay these higher prices as the means of securing the goods they want. In these circumstances, what is to stop prices from rising and a massive black market from developing? The answer is a combination of severe penalties combined with a great likelihood of being caught, and then actually suffering those penalties. Mere fines are not likely to provide much of a deterrent. They will be regarded simply as an additional business expense. If the government is serious about its price controls, it is necessary for it to impose penalties comparable to those for a major felony. But the mere existence of such penalties is not enough. The government has to make it actually dangerous to conduct black market transactions. It has to make people fear that in conducting such a transaction, they might somehow be discovered by the police and actually end up in jail. In order to create such fear, the government must develop an army of spies and secret informers. For example, the government must make a storekeeper and his customer fearful that if they engage in a black market transaction, some other customer in the store will report them. Because of the privacy and secrecy in which many black market transactions can be conducted, the government must also make anyone contemplating a black market transaction fearful that the other party might turn out to be a police agent trying to entrap him. The government must make people fearful even of their long-time associates, even of their friends and relatives, lest even they turn out to be informers. And finally, in order to obtain convictions, the government must place the decision about innocence or guilt in the case of black market transactions in the hands of an administrative tribunal or its police agents on the spot. It cannot rely on jury trials, because it is unlikely that many juries can be found willing to bring in guilty verdicts in cases in which a man might have to go to jail for several years for the crime of selling a few pounds of meat or a pair of shoes above the ceiling price. In sum, therefore, the requirements merely of enforcing price control regulations is the adoption of essential features of a totalitarian state, namely, the establishment of the category of economic crimes, in which the peaceful pursuit of material self-interest is treated as a criminal offense, and the establishment of a totalitarian police apparatus replete with spies and informers and the power of arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Clearly, the enforcement of price controls requires a government similar to that of Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, in which practically anyone might turn out to be a police spy, and in which a secret police exists, and has the power to arrest and imprison people. If the government is unwilling to go to such lengths, then, to that extent, its price controls prove unenforceable and simply break down. The black market then assumes major proportions. Incidentally, none of this is to suggest that price controls were the cause of the reign of terror instituted by the Nazis. The Nazis began their reign of terror well before the enactment of price controls. As a result, they enacted price controls in an environment ready-made for their enforcement. Black market activity entails the commission of further crimes. Under de facto socialism, the production and sale of goods in the black market entails the defiance of the government's regulations concerning production and distribution, as well as the defiance of its price controls. For example, the goods themselves that are sold in the black market are intended by the government to be distributed in accordance with its plan, and not in the black market. The factors of production used to produce those goods are likewise intended by the government to be used in accordance with its plan, and not for the purpose of supplying the black market. Under a system of de jure socialism, such as existed in Soviet Russia, in which the legal code of the country openly and explicitly makes the government the owner of the means of production, all black market activity necessarily entails the misappropriation or theft of state property. For example, the factory workers or managers in Soviet Russia who turned out products that they sold in the black market were considered as stealing the raw materials supplied by the state. Furthermore, in any type of socialist state, Nazi or communist, the government's economic plan is part of the supreme law of the land. We all have a good idea of how chaotic the so-called planning process of socialism is. Its further disruption by workers and managers siphoning off materials and supplies to produce for the black market is something which a socialist state is logically entitled to regard as an act of sabotage of its national economic plan. And sabotage is how the legal code of a socialist state does regard it. Consistent with this fact, black market activity in a socialist country often carries the death penalty. Now I think that a fundamental fact that explains the all-round reign of terror found under socialism is the incredible dilemma in which a socialist state places itself in relation to the masses of its citizens. On the one hand, it assumes full responsibility for the individual's economic well-being. Russian or Bolshevik-style socialism openly avows this responsibility. This is the main source of its popular appeal. On the other hand, in all of the ways one can imagine, a socialist state makes an unbelievable botch of the job. It makes the individual's life a nightmare. Every day of his life, the citizen of a socialist state must spend time in endless waiting lines. For him, the problems Americans experienced in the gasoline shortages of the 1970s are normal, only he does not experience them in relation to gasoline, for he does not own a car, and has no hope of ever owning one, but in relation to simple items of clothing, to vegetables, even to bread. Even worse, he is frequently forced to work at a job that is not of his choice, and which he therefore must certainly hate. For under shortages, the government comes to decide the allocation of labor just as it does the allocation of the material factors of production. And he lives in a condition of unbelievable overcrowding, with hardly ever a chance for privacy. In the face of housing shortages, boarders are assigned to homes, families are compelled to share apartments. And a system of internal passports and visas is adopted to limit the severity of housing shortages in the more desirable areas of the country. To put it mildly, a person forced to live in such conditions must seethe with resentment and hostility. Now against whom would it be more logical for the citizens of a socialist state to direct their resentment and hostility than against that very socialist state itself? The same socialist state, which has proclaimed its responsibility for their life, has promised them a life of bliss, and which in fact is responsible for giving them a life of hell. Indeed, the leaders of a socialist state live in a further dilemma, in that they daily encourage the people to believe that socialism is a perfect system whose bad results can only be the work of evil men. If that were true, who in reason could those evil men be but the rulers themselves, who have not only made life a hell, but have perverted an allegedly perfect system to do it? It follows that the rulers of a socialist state must live in terror of the people. By the logic of their actions and their teachings, the boiling, seething resentment of the people should well up and swallow them in an orgy of bloody vengeance. The rulers sense this, even if they do not admit it openly, and thus their major concern is always to keep the lid on the citizenry. Consequently, it is true, but very inadequate merely to say such things as that socialism lacks freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Of course, it lacks these freedoms. If the government owns all the newspapers and publishing houses, if it decides for what purposes newsprint and paper are to be made available, then obviously nothing can be printed which the government does not want printed. If it owns all the meeting halls, no public speech or lecture can be delivered which the government does not want delivered. But socialism goes far beyond the mere lack of freedom of press and speech. A socialist government totally annihilates these freedoms. It turns the press and every public forum into a vehicle of hysterical propaganda in its own behalf, and it engages in the relentless persecution of everyone who dares to deviate by so much as an inch from its official party line. The reason for these facts is the socialist rulers' terror of the people. To protect themselves, they must order the propaganda ministry and the secret police to work round the clock. The one, to constantly divert the people's attention from the responsibility of socialism and of the rulers of socialism for the people's misery. The other, to spirit away and silence anyone who might even remotely suggest the responsibility of socialism or its rulers, to spirit away anyone who begins to show signs of thinking for himself. It is because of the rulers' terror and their desperate need to find scapegoats for the failures of socialism that the press of a socialist country is always full of stories about foreign plots and sabotage, and about corruption and mismanagement on the part of subordinate officials, and why, periodically, it is necessary to unmask large-scale domestic plots and to sacrifice major officials and entire factions in giant purges. It is because of their terror, and their desperate need to crush every breath even of potential opposition, that the rulers of socialism do not dare to allow even purely cultural activities that are not under the control of the state. For if people so much as assemble for an art show or poetry reading that is not controlled by the state, the rulers must fear the dissemination of dangerous ideas. Any unauthorized ideas are dangerous ideas, because they can lead people to begin thinking for themselves and thus to begin thinking about the nature of socialism and its rulers. The rulers must fear the spontaneous assembly of a handful of people in a room, and use the secret police and its apparatus of spies, informers, and terror either to stop such meetings, or to make sure that their content is entirely innocuous from the point of view of the state. Socialism cannot be ruled for very long except by terror. As soon as the terror is relaxed, resentment and hostility logically begin to well up against the rulers. The stage is thus set for a revolution or civil war. In fact, in the absence of terror, or, more correctly, a sufficient degree of terror, socialism would be characterized by an endless series of revolutions and civil wars, as each new group of rulers proved as incapable of making socialism function successfully as its predecessors before it. The inescapable inference to be drawn is that the terror actually experienced in the socialist countries was not simply the work of evil men, such as Stalin, but springs from the nature of the socialist system. Stalin could come to the fore because his unusual willingness and cunning in the use of terror were the specific characteristics most required by a ruler of socialism in order to remain in power. He rose to the top by a process of socialist natural selection, the selection of the worst. I need to anticipate a possible misunderstanding concerning my thesis that socialism is totalitarian by its nature. This concerns the allegedly socialist countries run by social democrats, such as Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries, which are clearly not totalitarian dictatorships. In such cases, it is necessary to realize that along with these countries not being totalitarian, they are also not socialist. Their governing parties may espouse socialism as their philosophy and their ultimate goal, but socialism is not what they have implemented as their economic system. Their actual economic system is that of a hampered market economy, as Mises termed it. While more hampered than our own in important respects, their economic system is essentially similar to our own, in that the characteristic driving force of production and economic activity is not government decree, but the initiative of private owners motivated by the prospect of private profit. The reason that social democrats do not establish socialism when they come to power is that they are unwilling to do what would be required. The establishment of socialism as an economic system requires a massive act of theft. The means of production must be seized from their owners and turned over to the state. Such seizure is virtually certain to provoke substantial resistance on the part of the owners, resistance which can be overcome only by use of massive force. The communists were and are willing to apply such force, as evidenced in Soviet Russia. Their character is that of armed robbers prepared to commit murder, if that is what is necessary to carry out their robbery. The character of the Social Democrats, in contrast, is more like that of pickpockets, who may talk of pulling the big job someday, but who in fact are unwilling to do the killing that would be required, and so give up at the slightest sign of serious resistance. As for the Nazis, they generally did not have to kill in order to seize the property of Germans other than Jews. This was because, as we have seen, they established socialism by stealth, through price controls, which served to maintain the outward guise and appearance of private ownership. The private owners were thus deprived of their property, without knowing it, and thus felt no need to defend it by force. I think I have shown that socialism, actual socialism, is totalitarian by its very nature. In the United States at the present time, We do not have socialism in any form. And we do not have a dictatorship, let alone a totalitarian dictatorship. We also do not yet have fascism, though we are moving towards it. Among the essential elements that are still lacking are one-party rule and censorship. We still have freedom of speech and press and free elections, though both have been undermined and their continued existence cannot be guaranteed. What we have is a hampered market economy that is growing ever more hampered by ever more government intervention, and that is characterized by a growing loss of individual freedom. The growth of the government's economic intervention is synonymous with a loss of individual freedom, because it means increasingly initiating the use of physical force to make people do what they do not voluntarily choose to do, or prevent them from doing what they do voluntarily choose to do. Since the individual is the best judge of his own interests, and at least as a rule seeks to do what it is in his interest to do, and to avoid doing what harms his interest, it follows that the greater the extent of government intervention, the greater the extent to which individuals are prevented from doing what benefits them, and are instead compelled to do what causes them loss. Today, in the United States, government spending, federal, state, and local, amounts to almost half of the monetary incomes of the portion of the citizenry that does not work for the government. 15 federal cabinet departments, and a much larger number of federal regulatory agencies, together, in most instances with counterparts at the state and local level, routinely intrude into virtually every area of the individual citizen's life. In countless ways he is taxed, compelled, and prohibited. The effect of such massive government interference is unemployment, rising prices, falling real wages, a need to work longer and harder, and growing economic insecurity. The further effect is growing anger and resentment. Though the government's policy of interventionism is their logical target, the anger and resentment people feel are typically directed at businessmen and the rich instead. This is a mistake which is fueled for the most part by an ignorant and envious intellectual establishment and media. And in conformity with this attitude, since the collapse of the stock market bubble, which was in fact created by the Federal Reserve's policy of credit expansion and then pricked by its temporary abandonment of that policy, government prosecutors have adopted what appears to be a particularly vengeful policy toward executives guilty of financial dishonesty, as though their actions were responsible for the widespread losses resulting from the collapse of the bubble. Thus the former head of a major telecommunications company was recently given a 25-year prison sentence. Other top executives have suffered similarly. Even more ominously, the government's power to obtain mere criminal indictments has become equivalent to the power to destroy a firm, as occurred in the case of Arthur Andersen, the major accounting firm. The threatened use of this power was then sufficient to force major insurance brokerage firms in the United States to change their managements to the satisfaction of New York State's Attorney General. There is no way to describe such developments other than as conviction and punishment without trial and as extortion by the government. These are major steps along a very dangerous path. Fortunately, there is still sufficient freedom in the United States to undo all the damage that has been done. There is first of all the freedom to publicly name it and denounce it. More fundamentally, there is the freedom to analyze and refute the ideas that underlie the destructive policies that have been adopted or that may be adopted. And that is what is critical. For the fundamental factor underlying interventionism, and, of course, socialism as well, whether Nazi or communist, is nothing but wrong ideas. Above all, wrong ideas about economics and philosophy. There is now an extensive and growing body of literature that presents sound ideas in these two vital fields. In my judgment, the two most important authors of this literature are Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand. An extensive knowledge of their writings is an indispensable prerequisite for success in the defense of individual freedom and the free market. Author George Reisman. George Reisman, Ph.D., is Pepperdine University Professor Emeritus of Economics and the author of Capitalism, a treatise on economics, Ottawa, Illinois, Jameson Books, 1996, Kindle edition, 2012.